How was England formed? So let me get this straight. According to Wikipedia, England became a country in 927 AD when this guy, King Aethelstan, conquered all of these other smaller kingdoms and made them into one big kingdom. But that can't be right. I mean, there were people living there before this King Aethelstan guy, and if he just came along and conquered everyone, then why is it called England and not Aethelstan land? And what happened to all those other people who were there first? So I decided to do some digging, and it turns out the story of how England was formed is a bit more complicated than that. You see, the people who lived in what is now England before Aethelstan came along were the Anglo-Saxons. And they didn't just pop out of nowhere. They moved into the area during the 5th and 6th centuries after the Roman Empire fell apart and its provinces got taken over by different Germanic tribes. These tribes had been migrating into Britain since the 3rd century, but their large-scale immigration only started after Rome fell. So technically speaking, England wasn't formed when Aethelstan conquered everyone, because the Anglo-Saxons already kind of formed England. But then again, at the same time, England wasn't quite finished forming either, because the Anglo-Saxons hadn't fully conquered all of the other native Britons who lived in the area either. So yeah, it's kind of complicated. But regardless, we're going to talk about how the Anglo-Saxons took over and set up their kingdoms in the first place, how the Vikings came and partially conquered England, and how the Anglo-Saxons fought back and eventually formed the Kingdom of England. So, like I said, England wasn't formed when Aethelstan came along. It actually started way earlier when these Germanic tribes from what is today northern Germany known as Anglo-Saxons began moving into Britain. Their name is thought to come from the river with that name in northern Germany. This is the Angel, by the way. And they weren't the only Germanic people moving into Britain. There were also the Jutes, who settled in what are today Kent and Sussex, and the Saxons, who settled in what are today Essex and Middlesex. These tribes spoke similar languages and shared cultural similarities. In fact, they were probably related. But even though they shared a lot in common, each tribe was still independent. Like the Jutes were able to form their own kingdom in Kent, which they named after their homeland of Jutland. The Saxons did the same thing in Essex, and the Anglo-Saxons formed their own kingdoms in Sussex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria, plus 2 more down here that don't exist anymore. Oh, and by the way, these aren't the only kingdoms that existed in England during this period. There were also the Britons, the Scots, and the Picts, but they weren't really Anglo-Saxon. So we won't focus on them in this video. Anyway, the Anglo-Saxons weren't invaders. They were immigrants who asked permission to move into the Roman province of Britannia, probably because they knew the Romans could not control the area anymore, and assumed it would be easier to rule over themselves than under the decaying Roman Empire. The Roman emperor at the time granted them citizenship and made them Roman soldiers, which isn't surprising considering many of these Germanic tribes had already served in the Roman army for years by that point. But even though the Anglo-Saxons were now official allies of Rome, they still kind of acted like enemies because while on paper they were Roman citizens, in practice they were free to do pretty much whatever they wanted. In fact, they kind of screwed over the Romans. Like when Rome was still around, they had built roads, aqueducts, cities, and farms across the province. But once the Anglo-Saxons arrived, they abandoned these Roman ways of life and went back to their old ways instead, building small villages, practicing agriculture, and living off the land. The Anglo-Saxons ruled their petty kingdoms independently for the next 2 centuries until the mid-8th century, when a guy named Offa, king of Mercia, tried to unite all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under his rule. But his dream of uniting England failed after he died in 796. After that, it seemed like the various kingdoms were going to continue ruling independently like they had for so long. But then everything changed when the Danish and Norwegian Vikings began raiding the British Isles. And to be honest, the Anglo-Saxons had been dealing with Viking raids for decades by that point. But in 865, a Viking army invaded Northumbria and stayed there, conquering the kingdom and making it a part of their empire. A few years later, a Viking army also took over East Anglia. So suddenly, 2 of the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were gone, and it seemed like the rest wouldn't be able to stop the Vikings from taking over the whole island because they were too busy fighting each other. But luckily for them, a young prince from Wessex named Alfred managed to unite most of the remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms against the Vikings. He took on the Vikings and beat them at the Battle of Edington in 878. After that, the Vikings never invaded inland England again. They stuck to the coast from then on. Alfred's son, King Aethelstan, continued his father's legacy by further expanding the kingdom of Wessex. He defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937 and defeated the Scots, the Britons, and the Welsh at the Battle of Maljansea in 942. By the end of his reign, he controlled all of England south of the River Humber. His son, King Edgar, continued expanding the kingdom of Wessex by conquering all of northern England except for the Danelaw. So while Aethelstan wasn't the first Anglo-Saxon king, he was the first to rule over all of England. You could say that England was finally formed in 954 when King Edgar succeeded his father and inherited his kingdom. Even though Edgar was only king for 10 years, he passed several reforms to make sure England would stay at peace and united. He hosted a massive council of all the nobles in England, reaffirmed the laws that his predecessors had made, and declared that no one would pay taxes or levies without the consent of the people. He also worked with the Vikings and made an alliance with the king of the Danelaw, which brought peace to the border areas between the 2 kingdoms. In fact, he spent so much time trying to maintain peace that he earned the nickname Edgar the Peaceful. Edgar also helped put down a rebellion against his authority, which threatened to tear England apart and return it to the days of independent petty kingdoms. So clearly, King Edgar was vital to the formation of England. He set the foundations upon which future monarchs would build. He stopped the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms from tearing themselves apart. And he also forged peace with the Vikings, preventing another foreign power from taking over England. Technically speaking, England was united before Edgar, but he was the one who really laid the groundwork for the English kingdom to thrive. Unfortunately, Edgar died in 975, and after him, the throne passed to his 13-year-old son, King Edward the Martyr. Edward struggled to maintain control of the kingdom, partly because the nobility had grown tired of royal authority. They rebelled against him and assassinated him in 978. Then his brother, King Aethelstan, tried to take the throne, but he was also murdered in 984. Next in line was Edward's cousin, King Ethelred the Unready, who turned out to be unable to deal with the nobility and restore royal authority. In fact, things got so bad that the English nobles invited the Vikings back into England to help them fight back against the king. It seemed like England might descend into chaos again. But luckily, a monk from the Kingdom of Wessex named S. Dunstan helped the king defeat the Vikings and reassert royal authority. With Dunstan's help, England enjoyed a period of stability and prosperity, mostly thanks to the booming economy caused by the Viking trade. In 1012, though, King Ethelred died and the throne passed to his son, Edmund Ironside. The problem was there was another claimant to the throne, a Viking named Canute the Great, who was also married to Ethelred's widow. Edmund fought against Canute for several years, but in 1016 he died at the Battle of Issanden, and Canute became the king of all of England. Canute wasn't the first Viking to rule England, but he was the first to rule over the entire country. Now, Canute was actually pretty cool. He promoted Christianity throughout his empire, visited Russia to negotiate a peace treaty, and made laws protecting the poor and widows. Plus, he even tried to invade the Byzantine Empire, although that ended badly. In 1035, after Canute died, the throne passed to his son, Harthacnut. But Harthacnut was unpopular in England, and when he died in 1042, the throne went to a man named Edward the Confessor. Edward was loved by his people, and he invited a bunch of monks from Normandy to rebuild the city of London after fire destroyed a large part of it. When Edward died in 1066, though, The throne passed to his cousin, William, Duke of Normandy, starting the Norman conquest of England. The story of William's invasion and how England became a Norman kingdom is famously told in the Bayeux Tapestry. Anyway, that's the story of how England was formed. The Anglo-Saxons conquered the island and set up their kingdoms. The Vikings invaded and conquered parts of England. The Anglo-Saxons fought back and reclaimed their territory and ultimately conquered all of England. Then, England was conquered by the Normans. But I'll save that story for another video. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content. Bye.